Well, welcome. If you haven't been with us for the last few weeks, obviously we're in this series called I Don't Wanna. And I don't know if you've ever said that to God. I certainly have said that to God. In fact, when I was first starting out as a Christian, I think I probably said that more than anything else I said to God. I'd read something in the Bible, and honestly, this still happens. It happened just recently. I read something, it felt like it immediately applied to me, and I began to argue. I said, God, I don't see why I have to do that. I don't want to do that. It doesn't seem like that's on me. I don't want to. You know, the biggest part, and I said this earlier in the series, the hardest part maybe for me, and maybe it's not for you, is that there just aren't a lot of places where God tells us, and here's why. Here's what I want you to do, and here's why. So sometimes when you're a Christ follower, and maybe you're joining today and you wouldn't say you're a follower of Christ, you sort of sense that there's something more out here, and that you're being drawn to this and you're trying to figure it out. But as you look around and you're okay with coming, but you think to yourself, what about these rules? And what about all these things that I hear that don't seem to fit into my life? I mean, there's just so much of it I don't want to do. Well, that's what we've been talking about in this series for the last few weeks. And what we've been learning is that what God is up to in asking us to do these things is not just about our obedience. God is trying to get us to a place where we just say, hey, I trust you and I obey. But what he's after is not just like getting us on his plan. And sometimes people tend to think that what God's really after is, hey, I'm a follower of Jesus and I've changed a lot already and I do these 5 things, but here's a whole bunch of other stuff I don't do, and I just don't want to do those things. And what God's after is just to get me to do the whole thing. But honestly, God's not just after our cooperation. That's what we've been talking about for the last few weeks. There are other ways to get us to just do what he wants, if that's what he wants. But what God is after is God wants a relationship with us. And all great relationships are based on trust. So God is sometimes, I think often, will ask us to do something that, not tell us why, to ask us to do something that in our natural reaction would be, I don't want to. But then when we finally come, as we've been looking at these people that we've been learning from the last few weeks, when I finally come to the place that I say, okay, because you're God, I'll do what you ask me to do. When I put my trust and my faith in what God has said because he asked me to, then when my faith intersects his faithfulness where he comes through, then my trust in him grows and our relationship grows. And ultimately, that's what God's after in our obedience. It's not just that we get on the same page, but that the relationship with him grows. Now today, and we've got one more week in this series, today I want to talk to you about something that we really just have to talk about before we get done with this. I want to talk to you about the part that emotions wind up playing in our desire to sometimes say, I don't want to. And by that I mean is that there are emotions that you and I have that when they hit us, they're so strong that they almost feel like they have a have-to kind of component of it. That is, you know, there are emotions that if they hit you the right way, they'll wreck your finances. There are emotions that will push you past the moral boundaries that you set that you would tell everybody else they ought to set. There are emotions that when you get to a place that you feel this strong enough that you wind up just saying to God, I know what you say, but I don't want to. I've got to do what I feel like I have to do. And the emotions that I want to talk to you about, the ones I think that wind up putting us in those places are fear, anger, loneliness, and rejection. You know, that when I'm afraid and I feel that kind of fear that just creeps in on me, or when I have that kind of anger that it just would feel good to hurt someone, or when I'm so alone that I just can't stand it anymore, or when somebody I counted on that I trusted, they just let me down, they reject me. When I'm feeling these 4 emotions, these 4 tend to hit us in such a way that they have this kind of effect on us that we feel like, hey, there's just a part of it, I've got to get back in control. They have shaken me so bad. I'm so afraid. I'm so angry. I'm so lonely. I feel so rejected that I just feel like I have to do something to get back in control of my life. And when those things wind up happening, it almost feels like panic. It almost feels like, look, I can't count on anybody but me, and I've got to get this thing back on track the way it ought to go. But when we respond to those emotions in that way, what we wind up doing that feels almost natural, that feels like it's something we have to do, what feels right winds up being the thing that ultimately leads us to disaster. And I just say, today there are some of you that are joining in, and you're right at this place. You're at a place where you're about to make a decision, and it doesn't even feel like that big a decision to you, but you're on the verge of doing something. It doesn't feel like a big deal, but the only reason you're doing it is because of an emotion that's just overpowering you. I mean, if you're just honest, it's because you're afraid, or you're angry, or you're lonely, or you're rejected. And some of you are just tired of being alone. I mean, you're just tired of going home alone. You're tired of being in that house alone. You're tired of only having you. And you're about to make a decision. And if you were honest, what's pushing you to make the decision you're about to make is you're just lonely, or you're scared to death. Something's happened, and it shook you so bad, you're just afraid, and you don't know what's going to happen. And you're going to try to make a decision to try to get back in control. But what's driving that is just this fear. And you're about to do something you would normally not tell. You would counsel other people not to do what you're about to do, but it feels like you don't have any choice. It feels like the right thing. Because you feel so alone and so out of control, and you think you only can count on you. You're about to do something that's to lead to disaster. And today, God has you here where God can finally remind you, you are not alone. You do not only have you to count on, you can trust me. I am with you. Now today, I want to talk to you about this, and I want us to learn together from a guy that's in the older part of the Bible, and his name is David. And in many, many ways, David is unlike us, and in fact, he has some experiences that most of us are never going to have. But in most ways, particularly on the emotional side, David is exactly like us. And David's a guy that's called a man after God's own heart, but that doesn't mean he got everything right. In fact, the account I want to read you to today, he's a man that's so devoted to God, but he winds up blowing it in a way that I know that he can't imagine blowing it. And the reason he does is, I think, because he's all alone, and he's afraid, and he feels rejected. And he winds up doing something that winds up having incredible consequences. Now, before I get into this, let me give you some background on David, because I think if you can understand sort of the context of his life, it'll help you see where we're going to go in just a moment. David grows up on a farm. He's the son of a shepherd, and so he's the youngest in his family, a bunch of boys, and he's the youngest boy. And so when we first meet him, he's off tending sheep. And what happens is David gets anointed king of his country at a very young age, which is great, except there's a problem. They already have a king, and his name is Saul. But Saul has done so much wrong that God finally gets to the place and says, Saul, you may not trust me. That's obvious. You don't do what I ask. But I don't trust you anymore. And so I'm done. And so he sends his prophet Samuel, and he says, hey, go to the house of this man named Jesse, and one of his sons is going to be king. And so through this elaborate thing, he goes through all of the sons. He finally comes to David, and he says to David, David, you've been chosen. And in front of his whole family, in front of all of his brothers, David gets anointed king, which is great. He's a little kid, and he's been anointed king. But David at some point has to at least think about raising his hand and going, wait a second, I have a question. Don't we already have a king? Yes, David. But God has rejected Saul. And when the time is right, and that's the key, when the time is right, you're going to be king. So David carries this thing, that he's been anointed king, but the time's not right. And then through a whole series of stuff that I'll just compress down for you, David winds up, he fights a battle that becomes memorable. In fact, you still talk about it today. He fights a warrior named Goliath. And so David fights Goliath, and he wins the hearts of the nation. In fact, the king begins to love him, this guy named Saul that doesn't know yet David's been appointed to replace him. He becomes friends with Saul. He gets invited into Saul's entourage. In fact, he becomes the leader of Saul's army. He becomes such a strong, mighty warrior. Saul eventually gives him the hand of his daughter to marry. And then Saul's son, the prince, who should be king, he becomes David's best friend. And so everything's going along fine. And then the people begin to love David. David becomes like a rock star in their country. They write songs about what a great warrior he is. He's such an attractive person. And Saul gets incredibly jealous. Saul begins to realize that he's going to lose control of this and that Jonathan, his son, is going to lose the kingdom to David. And in fact, David eventually tells Jonathan that he's been anointed. And Jonathan's such a good friend, he's okay. He can see God's hands on David, and they continue to become friends. But at one point, Jonathan overhears his dad, Saul, plotting to kill David. And he comes to David, and in a very emotional encounter, he says to David, David, you can't be near my dad anymore. My dad's going to kill you. You've got to run for your life. And so in a very emotional departure, David begins to run away. He's all alone for the first time in a long time. He feels like everything's slipping out of control, that he's losing everything he has. His family is gone. His friends are gone. Everybody's gone. He's not king yet. That leads us to where I want to bring us today. He winds up in a little town called Nob. Let me read this to you. David went to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest. And Ahimelech trembled when he met him and asked, why are you alone? Why is no one with you? Now, why does he ask that? Well, it's because you never saw David alone. I mean, David's one of the most popular people in the country, and David's like the leader of the army, and David's always seen with his boys. He's got his entourage around him. He's got people around him, and he's got his bodyguards, and now here he is. He shows up in the middle of nowhere in a little town full of priests, and he's all alone. It'd be like this afternoon, you get a knock on the door, and you open the door, and it's Barack Obama. And you look around and you think, where is everybody? I mean, like the Secret Service and all the press, what are you doing here all alone? So Ahimelech asked him the logical question, why are you here, and why are you all alone? And David just outright lies. David answered Ahimelech the priest, the king sent me on a mission and said to me, no one is to know anything about the mission I'm sending you on. As for my men, I've told them to meet me at a certain place. Now then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread and whatever you can find. The king has sent me on a top secret mission. It's a top secret mission, and my men, they're right over there. They're going to meet me right over there. He just lies. Now, why did he do that? I mean, from our vantage point, we want to say, David, you don't have to lie. God is with you. I mean, since you were a little boy, when you were anointed king, God has been with you. When God said to you, go fight the giant, that didn't make sense to anybody, but you won because God was with you. All you have to do is just tell the truth. God will be with you in this place. But David had going on what you and I have going on. When David was in that place, when he felt like it was all coming apart, David stands there and he feels like, God got me here, but I got to take matters into my own hands, and I got to do what I need to do. So he lies. And Ahimelech gives him some food, and David's thinking, God promised that he's going to take care of me, but it's slipping away, and the feelings I have is I'm going to have to do something. So he began to manipulate, because after all, if I don't look out for me, who's going to look after me? I'm all alone. That day, David fled from Saul and went to Achish, the king of Gath, to the enemy. And of course, you know what David forgot. David forgot that the God who got him to that place, who took him from a little boy out of unknown to being the man everybody knew in the country, that the God who got him there would be the same God to watch over and sustain him and keep him there. When his success began to crumble, when his life began to get a little out of shape, when fear and anger and loneliness and rejection, when they began to speak to him and it began to crumble and things weren't going the way that he thought that they should go, I was nobody and God took me out of nothing, and now he's got me right here. But if I don't do something, I mean, when the plan begins to fall apart, he thinks, I've got to do something. And I know I used to trust God, but right now, I can only trust me. If I don't do this, everything's going to be off track. You and I are the same. And you know why? Because your emotions lie to you, and my emotions lie to me. When you get that feeling of loneliness, I mean, a feeling of being alone that's just like an ache. In fact, some of you don't want to go home because you feel it. And your emotions begin to speak to you. If God was with you, why would you feel so alone? If he's with you like everybody says, why would you be so alone? If God were standing for you, why are you so angry? Why do you have to stand up for yourself? Why wouldn't God do something? I mean, our emotions weave this very, very convincing story. And they convince us, hey, I know, God, you can take care of me, but right now, I mean, it feels like you're not paying much attention, so I'm going to have to do something. I've got to take control. I mean, some of us have been followers of Christ for a while. I mean, some of you have been doing this for a long time, and you've seen God answer your prayers. You've seen God do things for you. There are parts of your life that you'd look at and you go, that's a direct blessing of God, and she's a blessing of God, and he's a blessing of God, and my family's a blessing of God. And you'd look back over the course of your life and you'd say, I am where I am. God has brought me to this place. But let's be honest. It is a lot easier to trust God when you don't have anything but God to count on than it is when you think you can do something about it. I mean, a lot of us came to God, or we came back to God when we had already done everything we want to. We had said, I don't want it to everybody, and we'd gone out and done everything we wanted the way we wanted, and we wound up in a place where we hurt ourselves and hurt other people, and we had blown everything up. It's a lot easier to come back to God when you really have no other options. But when my life that I would said was blessed by God, and it was a blessing from God, that my whole life had been blessed by God, and now God wants me to do something, and I feel like it's getting shaky, and my emotions begin to tell me this is all at stake, and I now have to trust God. My emotions begin to lie to me, and I believe what you believe, what David believed. Here it is. God, I know you got me where I am. I know that. I'm not trying to take that away from you. But you sure don't seem to be paying much attention right now to what's happening in my life. And you're not very good at giving the support that I need right now. So I know what you say to do. In David's case, I know I ought to just tell the truth. I know what you say I should do. I know I should just trust you. But I'm going to have to take some action, and I'm going to have to do what I want to do. And the consequences of that are always a disaster. Here's what happened to David. There's a guy that's in Nob at the same time as David. His name is Doeg, and he's been watching the whole thing take place. He sees David come into town. He sees him talk to the priest. He sees the priest feed him and supply him. Doeg's a guy who wants to be really close to Saul. He loves Saul. He wants to be Saul's right-hand man. So he sees David, and he goes back to Saul. Well, when he gets to Saul, Saul is saying things like, David's not my friend anymore. Let's just be real clear. David and I are enemies, and I don't know where David is. If anybody can tell me where David is, I'll reward that person greatly. Anybody got any information? Well, Doeg goes, I do. I was just in Nob, and David was there. And the priests of the city, they supplied him. They took care of him. That's where David is. So Saul and his army, they load up and they ride off to Nob. And he gets there and he says to Ahimelech, Ahimelech, did you wind up just helping David? And Ahimelech goes, you bet I did. I mean, everybody knows David's your right-hand man. He's married to your daughter. I sure did help your son-in-law, king. And Saul goes, David's not my friend. David is my enemy. And because you help my enemy, that makes you my enemy. Look at what happens. The king said, you will surely die, Ahimelech, you and your father's whole family. Then the king ordered the guards at his side, turn and kill the priest of the Lord, because they too have sided with David. They knew he was fleeing, yet they did not tell me. Now let me ask you, did they know that David was running from Saul? No, they didn't know. Because David took it into his own hands. He didn't do what God would have had him do. He said, I don't want to tell the truth. David lied. But the king's officials were not willing to raise a hand to strike the priest of the Lord. The king then ordered Doeg, you turn, strike down the priest. So Doeg the Edomite turned and struck them down. That day he killed 85 men who wore in the linen ephod, means they were priests. He also put the sword to Nob, the town of the priests, with its men and women, its children and infants, its cattle and donkeys and sheep. But Abiathar, the son of Ahimelech, son of Ahitub, escaped and fled to David. He told David that Saul had killed the priest of the Lord. And David said to Abiathar, that day when Doeg the Edomite was there, David saw him. That's what we learned. He knew he was there. That day, I knew he would be sure to tell Saul, I am responsible for the death of your father's whole family. Now, I don't want you to miss this because I know that story is so extreme. But imagine the emotion that, there's emotion that drove David to do this. Now imagine the emotion that floods David knowing that your lie, that your disobedience, because you couldn't trust God, because you said, I don't want to do what you asked me to do, it cost a whole town of people their lives. All because David forgot. God is with me. From the time I was a little boy, God has been with me. I don't have to be afraid. I don't have to disobey. God is with me. I can trust him. I can just do what he asked me to do. I can trust him to take care of the circumstance. He's what got me here. God is with me, and the God who is with me can keep me. He can fulfill the promises he had me. God is with me. But his emotions, they drove him to wind up doing something, and panicked, and everybody suffered. Now, I know you can't relate to that. I mean, that whole story just sounds, it's almost so over the top, it sounds like a fairy tale, but from where I sit as your pastor, from what I've gotten to watch for the last 25 years being here, working among you, is that I watch men and women all the time react to stuff out of emotion that winds up blowing up their lives and their family and their kids and their grandkids. All simply because of their emotions weave this carefully convincing story of what they have to do, and they say, I know what God wants. I don't want to do that. I'm not going to do that. I can't. I'm so angry. I'm so scared. I'm so lonely. They wind up blowing up everything. I mean, time after time, I watch you and me in our culture overcome with rejection or anger or fear or loneliness, and we take things into our own hands and we say, I can't trust God with this. I just can't. I'll come to church and I'll trust you with my eternity. After all, I don't have another card to play on how I get to heaven. But when it comes to trusting who I marry, when it comes to trusting who I date, when it comes to trusting what I do sexually, when it comes to trusting how I do ethically, when it comes to trusting with my morals, I'll have to do what I have to do. I don't want to do what you want to. I'll trust you with heaven. But honestly, I don't have anything else to play on that. When it comes to my life, I don't want to trust you. And the fact is, some of you know the results of this firsthand because some of you grew up in homes with moms or dads that had the same emotion running through them. And I mean, you're just a little kid and you're watching mom and dad try to deal with their anger or deal with their fear or deal with their loneliness, and they try to deal with it with a bottle, or they deal with it with a pill, or they deal with it by jumping from person to person to person, and you get dragged along afterwards, and it's affected you your whole life long. And yet here you are, and I mean, there's single parents watching this, and you're about to make a decision to take you and your kids into something, and you know he's not right. You know she's not right. You know it's not the right thing, but you are just so tired of being alone that you're gonna risk everything because you can't trust that God is with you, sees you, and knows what's best for you. God says to us through David's example, you don't have to be afraid. You're with me. You can trust me. I'll take care of you. I am with you. Now, there's another part of the story, and I conveniently skipped over it because, well, it's the best part. And I wanted to save it for last, but honestly, the reason I saved it is because I don't think you can see things like this except in retrospect. And I only think David eventually sees it in retrospect. So get yourself back in the place where we were just a minute ago. David's been running, and he's all alone, and he's afraid that all of God's plans for him, that he's going to be king. So he lies about being on this mission from the king. He tells it to the priest, but he's hungry, and so he's got to give the priest to get him some food. And so he feeds him, and after he's eaten, he says to the priest, oh, by the way, I don't have any weapons. I'm on this mission from the king, and he forgot to send me with a weapon. So the priest, they say, well, this is a city of priests. We don't have any weapons. And then the priest remembers, oh, there is one weapon. Here's what he says. This is such a God thing. The priest replied, the sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley Elah, is here. It's wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you want it, take it. There's no sword here but that one. David said, there's none like it. Give it to me. So don't miss this. Right in the middle of David lying, right in the middle of him making this whole thing up, right of him taking his whole life into his hands, God comes right in the middle of it and says, David, remember when you were a little boy, you went out to see your brothers at camp, and that giant was down there screaming, everybody was afraid, and you said, God is with me. And if God tells me to go fight that giant, you fight that giant, and I'll win. You remember how you stepped down in that valley and you knew that I was with you? And you now hold the sword in your hand that Goliath trusted to be stronger than the power of God. And you defeated him in that sword because I was with you. David, I'm with you. I'm with you, David. Here right now, I'm with you. Remember, David, I'll take care of you. David, trust me. Obey me. Let's tell the truth right now. Trust me. Obey me. Remember, I'm still with you. I think in the middle of this whole thing, God is trying through the sword of Goliath to speak to David. But David's so overcome with his fear and his rejection that he misses it. He doesn't see it. And he grabs that sword and he's going to place his trust in a sword that could not stand against the power of God. Instead of just trusting his life to the power of God. See, today God has some of us here. This is your reminder. That's what today has been about for some of us. David missed his reminder. But some of us are here right now. And God's trying to say to you, remember? Remember? Remember those prayers you prayed back in the day? Remember when I was with you? So would you right now grab a connection card and let me talk to you for just a moment about next steps? Your connection card should be on a seat nearby, and we ask everybody to just put their name on it, put an email address or a way we can text you. We pray for every one of these, and we would love to pray for you if you just put that in the offering in just a few minutes. But before you're finished with it, would you flip it over to the back and look at the place where it talks about next steps? I just want us to think about this together. For many of us, we stand right at the point of the conflict between what God has done for us and what it seems like God isn't doing right now. We stand at this conflict between right and wrong, of what we know we should do, of what we should trust, and where we should go. And we don't want to do what's wrong, but we feel like we just have to do something, and God doesn't seem to be paying attention. And God's just saying to you, hey, remember. With this week, you just take some time and you just remember. Remember when you were alone and you prayed that you'd have a family, and look around, I blessed you. Remember those prayers you prayed when you were so afraid of what would happen in your life? And you were so angry about what had been done to you and how I've been with you? Remember where you were before you gave your life to Jesus and you began to follow? Remember how little joy, how much how you had no peace in your life, how you hurt other people and you're hurting yourself, and you turn to me, remember where I brought you. Remember. And trust me and obey me. For today, for some of you, He's just trying to say to you, okay, here you are. Here you are at the place. And here's a lie. Remember where it got you last time when you did this thing that you're thinking about doing? Remember what happened when you went with that person you knew was wrong? Remember where that took you? Here's your chance. Remember where you were when you were on the edge financially and now you're about to go back out there again? Remember? And I know what your emotions are telling you. I know what it's driving you to do. And I know what your circumstances are telling you. And I know how afraid you are. But nothing has changed. Remember, I'm with you. Nothing has changed. The issue we have to decide is like David. Are we going to trust in ourselves and trust in the power of something that before couldn't stand up to the power of God? Or are we going to trust ourselves to the power of God? This week, many of us need to spend time just remembering and giving ourselves back to trust in God. Let me ask you to just be honest with yourself and ask you to think about your life. I mean, you're single and there's this guy or this gal and you know they're not right. They're about 3 degrees off. But you think you can reach out there and you pull them in and you can make it all right. But you know in your heart, you need to be done with that. You're here financially and you're just sort of getting on your feet, but there's some opportunities and they're just outside. And you know they're going to pull you away from what you need to do. That job's going to make you miss out on connections you have with people that are helping you stay on track. But you're going to have to do it so you can have more money. And God's just saying to you, hey, trust me. I am with you. Here's the question you have to think about with your life. If you knew for sure that God was with you, if you knew for sure that He loved you, if you knew for sure that He would stand with you and support you, what would you do then? Well, why don't you do that with your life? Because God is with you. And He does love you. And He will support you. Why don't you just do that? In fact, I want to end by, I want to show you what God says. In fact, I want this to be so clear. I printed it on your program this week so that you can make sure to have it, take it home. It's on the back, on the notes side. But we'll put it on the screen. Let's just read this out loud together. Here's what God says. So be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid and do not panic. For the Lord your God will personally go ahead of you. He will neither fail you nor abandon you. But God, why? God, why don't you do? Are you going to trust me? Are you going to trust in yourself? I will neither fail you nor abandon you. So wait and trust and obey me. Let's pray. Father in heaven, I pray right now for every person that's joined in today. None of us are here by accident. None of us joined in by accident. And I pray that you'll help us remember. And right now, God, that you will do by your Spirit what I cannot do, that you'll speak to each heart in a way that they'll know that it's you and draw them to you. Thank you for your love, for your steadfast love to us, for being with us. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.